decided to start kind of figuring out my own method. Like, what actually works? Is sourdough really this delicate organism, or like does it take a lot to kill it? And that's the first point, is it takes a lot to kill sourdough. Keep it fed or cold and it will be fine. Welcome to Simply Living Homestead, where we empower homesteaders and preserve traditions. I'm your host, Amanda Carlin, and I help homesteading families bring peace and order to their lives. My friend, are you overwhelmed with all the tasks on your homestead? Do you wish for a mentor to guide you through the tough moments each day? Then you've come to the right place. Together we will learn to organize our homestead, love our families well, and walk in the peace of God. If you're ready to get unstuck from the constant feeling of overwhelm, then join us each week as we explore practical advice, inspiring stories, and heartfelt encouragement to help you thrive. Let's grow a sustainable, meaningful life together, both in the home and on the homestead. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Today we are going to be talking about sourdough, specifically things that I've learned to make it easier and less overwhelming. Sourdough is one of those things that's often considered a gateway into homesteading or the crunchy community or just a more natural life. It's one of those things that's fed to you on Pinterest and Instagram and all of the social media platforms. All the cool homesteaders, all the cool women do sourdough. And I had that too, where like it was this thing that you needed to do. You couldn't just make bread, you had to make sourdough. And there's a lot of benefits to sourdough over a traditional yeasted bread. I am going to put a note in here right now that if you are making just bread in general and not buying it from the store, that, my friend, is great. And you should be doing that. If that is what you are doing for your family right now and you are thriving on yeasted bread, you do not need to feel shame over not being able to do sourdough or struggling with sourdough. If you're choosing to just buy bread from the store, I am not going to sit here and shame you. But a lot of my friends have been talking about sourdough here recently. A lot of people have been looking at me and going, Amanda, you do sourdough, right? Yeah, I do. And then they'll proceed to tell me a problem that they've been having. So I thought I'd record this podcast today to answer some of the questions that I have been getting in regards to sourdough and some of the places where we can find it to be easier. Things that I have found that it feels like some people make it more complicated or their method is more complicated. So I thought today we would touch on that. When I first started getting into sourdough, I didn't even have very much knowledge on baking bread in general. I had tried it when I was a teenager before I had gotten married, and the loaves that I made were some of the worst loaves ever. One was too salty, one was too bland, one didn't rise properly, and I think I tried 3 times, and I kind of had this complex as a teenager where if I wasn't instantly good at it, I wasn't good at it at all, and so I needed to I just walked away from it. So, got married, moved back to the farm, and decided that I wanted to start making sourdough again. Got some starter from a friend, and then proceeded to go online and go, how do I make sourdough? What do I do? And I found a course, and I think I spent a good $100 on it. It was extremely detailed. The lady that was doing it was incredibly knowledgeable, but she was doing sourdough in a very scientific, very detail-oriented way. It was very hard for me to know how to even document every single step that I was taking always and keep a log of every single loaf of bread I ever made and weigh everything out in grams and ounces and have to calculate all of these different ratios. And I was about ready to walk away from it. I had this starter. I had paid a decent amount of money for a course and I hated it. And so as a last ditch attempt, because I did like the taste of the bread, I was like, well, maybe I should just try my own way. And so I did. And I'll be honest, I didn't stick with the program very long. I was fed up very quickly. And I know that her way would have worked, but it was too much for me. It really was. So I went rogue and decided to start kind of figuring out my own method. Like what actually works? Is sourdough really this delicate organism, or like does it take a lot to kill it? And that's the first point, is it takes a lot to kill sourdough. Keep it fed or cold and it will be fine. No, seriously. So what I figured out is that either it needs to be fed and like kept very active, up, down, or it needs to be cold. And if it is one of those two things, you're not really gonna kill your sourdough. Now, if you leave it on your counter where it is warm and you don't feed it, yeah, you could definitely kill your sourdough. But honestly, just take it and shove it in the fridge. Seriously, just take it and throw it in the fridge. If you are struggling to get it fed, if you are going, I'm going to be gone for a week on a trip, or this week is really hectic, I've got things I got to run the kids to, we have a big week on the farm, or we have family activities that we have to take care of, just put it in the fridge. Just put it in the fridge. If it turns pink or has green mold on it, pitch it. Okay. If it's smelling really, really off and funky, and I'm not talking like yeasty, I'm talking like a spoiled smell, kind of like if you have a garbage bucket where you're raking your leftovers into the things that your children didn't eat on the plate, or maybe your trash can. If it's like starting to smell akin to that, something may have gone wrong. But really, I promise you, it takes a lot to kill sourdough. And I can say this with a surety because I am the most forgetful person on the planet. I have ADHD. I can walk away from something and never see it again. And when it comes to sourdough starter specifically, it does. It takes a lot to kill it. So then you may be asking, well, Amanda, what do you do with your sourdough? So here is my feeding method. And if you are wanting this written down, I mean, you can always, find this again, write it down yourself, take notes. I hope you do. But you can also find it on my blog. I'll have it written out there for you. What my feeding method is. So here is my feeding method. Keep it in the fridge in a mason jar with a beeswax cloth on it. I've also been known to just simply put a cloth napkin on top of it with a rubber band, but something to kind of keep particles from falling in, but you do kind of want it to breathe a little bit. Okay, so keep it in the fridge. Pull it out the day before you want to use it and feed it about the same amount of flour and water as you have starter. Okay. Feed it again a few hours before you use it. After using, leave about 1/4 cup of starter in the jar, feed the same amount of water and flour, and place it back in the fridge. I have kept mine in the fridge without feeding it for as much as 2 months. I'll touch on reviving it a little bit later in the show, if you leave it there for 2 months, you are not going to probably want to bake with it the day after you pull it out of the fridge. When that was a pretty hectic time of my life. A lot of my last year has been a lot, and I couldn't keep up with it. So it got shoved to the back of the fridge, and I pulled it back out, and I was able to get it going again. If you do leave it in there for like longer than 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I would say you should probably revive it for a few days before using it. But just know that, like, I've done it. It's really hard to kill your starter. Point 2. There are lots of ways to feed your starter. If you've heard terms like 1 to 1 to 5 or 1 to 1 to 1 or any other combination of how you are supposed to be feeding your starter, just know it doesn't actually have to be that specific. Consistency is more important, and then you should adjust the ratio to your liking. When you are adjusting how thick or thin you like your starter, remember that moisture in your recipe needs to be balanced too. So try and stay consistent with your consistency. So once you kind of pick a consistency that you really like, so you've got your jar. I use a mason jar just so we have context of how I'm talking about this. You have your jar with starter in it, and you're taking your knife or your spoon or whatever, stirring it. Some people like it really thick. Like it's like kind of a batter. Other people like to be able to like free flow pour it, where if you picked it up and you have starter stuck to your spoon or your knife or your stirring utensil, it's gonna like run off of it. There's a really big spectrum there, and the thing to know is that if it's stiff like batter, there's not near as much moisture in it as if it's runny. And if you find a recipe online or you're not used to that recipe, it could come out differently than the recipe calls for because of that moisture content. So as you're adjusting your consistency, that is something to keep in mind. But especially as you get more recipes that you like, and like, this is the recipe I use for bagels, this is the recipe I use for pizza dough, you are going to know that recipe, and you're going to know how your consistency works with that. That is part of baking. But when it comes to how much you should be feeding your starter, there are just a couple of rules, quote unquote, that maybe you should follow. And that is just simply never feed more than 3 times the amount of starter. So to clarify that, if you have 1/4 of a cup of starter down in the bottom of your jar, so that is 3/4 of a cup. That is 3/4 of a cup of flour and 3/4 of a cup of water. That's going to get you like 1.5 cups of batter plus the 1/4 of a cup that's already in there. That is a lot of batter. That is a lot of batter. If you go all the way up to that, it is going to take quite a while for the active sourdough organisms to really start working on all of that starter and make it into a really good starter. So just know that if you do have 1/4 of a cup of starter, you really don't want to be putting much more than that in it, because of the amount of time that it's going to take to like start really feeding off of it. The other option is that you can feed just a tiny bit, multiple times a day. If you're feeding a tiny amount and just keeping it alive that way, which is a totally fine method of doing it, make sure you're doing it at least twice a day. That sourdough starter is going to be really, really hungry if you're setting it on your counter and feeding it just a tiny bit, like once a day, no matter the temperature of your house. And then another thing to know is if you keep getting hooch between feedings, with the exception of it being kept in the fridge, It's hungry. Either feed it more often. Either feed it more often or a larger amount. So hooch, just for clarification, is that brown liquid that is on the top of your sourdough if it's hungry. Now, you're going to see this if you put it in the fridge like I do, especially if you're letting it sit in the fridge for weeks on end. It is a dark liquid that sits on top, and it is part of the sourdough starter that gives it its very classic sour taste. So if you're someone who kind of more prefers the taste of yeast bread or not as strong of sourdough, go ahead and dump that off, especially if it's in the fridge. Dump that off and then mix in new starter. If it's sitting on the counter and you're getting hooch, you are leaving it too long between feedings. And it is getting very hungry. And that's like the die-off of some of the organisms. And so, like, that's not a good spot to be. But in the fridge, I haven't found that to be that big of a problem. Okay, moving right along. Another question that comes up is, how do I know if my starter is even happy? It should bubble up if it's happy and eating, but it doesn't have to double. I had a friend that came to me and she's like, Amanda, like, I am scared to bake with this. It's not like working. Like, I've never seen my starter double. You know what? I haven't either. I know a lot of people's whose does. And I can't tell you why. I don't know the explanation behind why mine never doubles. And other people's do. I haven't found it to be a problem. You want it to be happy and bubbling and coming up. So a trick that you've probably seen on the internet if you've explored sourdough at all is to put a rubber band around your jar. And I really do recommend using like a mason jar or something tall as opposed to a bowl with lots of top surface area. It's just, I've seen it help like with the being able to see how active it is, but also just being able to, I do think it helps the sourdough starter, though I can't explain why, so I could definitely be wrong on that. But put a rubber band around it after you've fed it, and you should be able to see it come up. And if you've missed the peak, which is usually where it's doubled, when it comes back down, it takes a lot longer to get back to that level of the rubber band. So if you leave it for a few hours and in that amount of time it's doubled and started coming back down, it might seem to you like it didn't fully double. But it did. It just got higher and then has come back down. Another thing about knowing whether your starter is happy or if you can use it to make bread is mature starter is better than the new starter. Get some from a friend if you can. If you are just starting out on your journey, if you have a friend who has a sourdough starter, get it from them. Seriously. It will save you a lot of time in the process and a lot of times heartache and like frustration and trying to figure out why your sourdough starter hasn't started working. If you start it yourself, which is a totally viable option, it is very easy to do. If you start it yourself, good bread that is puffy and you know has like a good crunch and a good pillow and good amounts of like bubbles inside of it and stuff, it's going to take a little bit longer to get there. So especially if you're starting it yourself, and even if you've gotten some from a friend just to kind of get the hang of it, make other things for the first couple of weeks. There are other things that are super yummy to have, and if you are worried about, you know, your bread not turning out, make some other things to boost your confidence. There are a lot of recipes that actually use discard, which is unactive starter. Discard isn't just what you've thrown away, it's really just inactive starter. It's starter that hasn't like hit the peak of its bubbliness. So if you're using a discard recipe and your starter is a little bit active, it's just gonna going to puff up more. That's all it's going to do to that recipe. So discard recipes are often really good to like be experimenting with or testing your starter with. But when it comes to making bread, if you are getting good consistent rises and falls, make that bread and try it. And if it doesn't quite turn out the way you want it, take heart. There's a good chance that it's just not mature enough. Try again in a few days. It's not the end of the world, and you're doing a great job. So a little bit earlier, I had said that I was going to talk about reviving a starter. So to revive a starter, let's go over a couple of criterias. If your starter has sat a few days on the counter without food, you may have to revive it. If you've just taken it out of the fridge for a long period of time, say a couple of weeks to a month or more, you're probably going to have to revive it. Your starter is not dead. So first and foremost, your starter is not dead. It can be inactive, or if you just took it and mixed some stuff up, tried to get it to bubble, and then made some bread with it, you might not get super great bread. Kind of just like when you've got a new starter, for example. So what do we do to revive it? Well, the first thing you do is you need to pour off the hooch. I always do this, one, because I don't want any excess amount of sour flavor in it, and two, it helps me be able to control the moisture level a little bit better if I pour it off. It also makes the starter a little bit brown, and I like to have a very creamy colored starter. That is a personal preference and has really nothing to do with the starter itself. Okay, so you need to revive it. What do we do? Feed it about 1/4 cup of flour and water twice a day and keep it in a warm place. Do this for a week. This is something you should be doing if you're just plain starting a new starter, but reviving it, that's kind of the way that I would do it, is I stick it in a warm place. We have a big coffee maker. My husband loves coffee, and we went and bought like a full-blown commercial tanked coffee maker that stays plugged in all the time. Well, it's really warm over there, so I actually just stick my jar beside or on top of his coffee maker, and that's like setting it on a warming plate, honestly. So sometimes I can't set it on top if I don't want it to work too quickly. But, if it's set in the back of my fridge for quite a while, that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to feed it about 1/4 cup every single feeding, 1/4 cup of flour and 1/4 cup of water, and stir it and keep it in a warm place. Now, you're doing that. A 4-cup quart jar is gonna fill up before that week is over. So sometime in the middle of that week, make a discard recipe. My favorite one is discard tortillas. That is my favorite recipe to make with discard. It uses a decent amount of discard, and you get quite a bit of bang for your buck. It's kind of fun to make with kids. My husband and I like to make them together. So that is kind of what I like to do. And then at the end of the week, you should be able to make whatever you make again. You should have a happy starter by the end of it. You should be seeing that rise and fall of a happy, bubbly starter. It is better to keep on top of your starter. It's better to, pull it out once a week in your fridge and give it a little bit of food and shove it back in, even if you're not going to make anything with it. But it is totally possible to pull it back to life if it gets away from you. So, to recap, sourdough doesn't have to be scary. It really doesn't. It's very hard to kill it. You don't have to stress about the ratios. There's lots of ways to feed your starter. Give it a try. See what works for you. See what routines work for you. And go there. Go with that. If it does get away from you, there are ways to revive it. It is not difficult. I do have a bit of a distaste for anyone who makes sourdough feel difficult, because it doesn't have to be. There isn't a whole lot of extra steps between a sourdough loaf of bread and a yeast loaf of bread. So I hope that this gives you a little hope, a little insight, a little knowledge into sourdough. I hope it answers some of your questions. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, I hope you'll join our newsletter. We've got lots of great content coming down the line, including some more things about sourdough. You can go to simplylivinghomestead.com to get signed up. And if you have any other questions or tips about today's discussion on sourdough, send me an email at connect@simplylivinghomestead.com and tell me all about it. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for hanging out today, friend. Until next time, here at Simply Living Homestead. Well, neighbor, before you head out, I just want to say how much I've loved spending this time with you. If you too enjoyed our time together, don't forget to give us a follow and leave a quick review on your favorite podcast player. It really helps more women like us find their way to a simpler, more joyful life. And hey, if you know someone who'd enjoy this episode, why not share it with them? Let's keep growing this circle of encouragement together. Oh, and don't forget to join my email list. I've got some free printables and weekly tips waiting for you to help you live a purposeful, balanced life, one rooted right in the heart and home. Thanks for being here, friend. You're doing a great job. I can't wait to chat again next week here at the Simply Living Homestead.